Come on, you know what it is. You know what time it is. You know where it's at. It's Brighton. It's online. It's on your screens. It's at home. It's in work. Make sure your boss don't catch you because you know there's no such thing as a good boss. And you know wherever you are, this is TWT, the world transformed 20. Dan Lewis, hit me up on Twitter. It is think_become. Firewire, TikTok, and every social media platform going out there. We have got the wonderful, the amazing, the vibiest Claudia Fio in the house. Give me a cheer, people.
Hey, hi, hello, live and direct, TWT 2021. We're here in Brighton, and we're just about to get started, so let's go.
Oh, my days. Yes, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, everybody inside and outside the place. This is a place for everyone, and I am so ready for today. Yesterday was a madness, like, did you catch it?
I didn't. I missed the party, and I'm so upset because I can tell from how you're hanging today and the way everyone's hanging that I missed a good party last night, and I'm so upset. But
before the party, though, real talk, right? Before the party, we had Jeremy Corbyn inside the place. We had Sasha Josette inside the place. The place was packed. We couldn't even carry on the show. As Jeremy was leaving, it was just a madness. We had a real good time. Obviously, Novara came along. They hit up the thing. And, wait, you know what it's like when Novara come and take over. It's a takeover. You know what I mean? It's a takeover. And today at TWT in Brighton, there has been so much going on. There's been the march against TUI. Stop the deportations, TUI. We have continued the no access to the Sun newspaper. Bun yourself in the Sun newspaper. Just fly a jet into the sun and burn away. Yeah, we don't want you.
Get out of here.
Dust. Anyway, also we've had rallies on the Green New Deal, on anti-capitalism. We've got an anti-capitalism session coming up right here live on TWT TV. And what else is there? There's been so much. I can't keep up with everything that is going on. And there are queues round the block everywhere you go. So if you're planning on coming down to Brighton, get here early, get your tickets, be a part of the team. Now, after following us on Twitter and Instagram, what is the most important thing people can do, Claudia?
Donate. Oh, Jesus Christ, man. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Do all of the above. Follow on socials, donate, and support TWT.
I know. Become a supporter. £1 a month, £2 a month. If you've got £100 a month, man, I'll take it, you know?
Go right ahead.
I'll get my nails did. Do you know what I mean? Claudia's doing me out here. Show them the nails. Oh! It's fire. Can we get the fire for the nails, please? Where's the fire for the nails? Hey! Look, we got special effects now. Because so many of you donated yesterday, we've managed to get fire on the screen.
Special effects.
Trust me!
That's where the money's going.
It's all going on special effects. It's all going on TWT 21 TV. And also making sure that we can deliver the finest in political education at this beautiful festival. Now, I hope your phone is on silent, Claudia.
I'm about to put it on silent.
I heard the news out there because I believe it is time for the news.
That is exactly what time it is. So it came at the great time.
Powered by Bywire, we have got today's independent media news because we bun the mainstream, and you know what it is. Go on, Claudia.
So, to big up the independent media today, the first story we've got is from Open Democracy, and it's titled, "Why isn't Sabina Nessa getting the same attention as Sarah Everard?" Now, I think the answer to that question is pretty simple. She is a woman of colour, and Sarah Everard was a white woman. Now, I know the wider picture of this is obviously violence against women, but when you look at women of colour, they not only face the discrimination that you get of being a woman, you also get the discrimination of being a person of colour. So that's the reason I've picked out this story, because it's quite interesting. The story points out that within the first week, I think, of Sarah's death, there was 50% more coverage on social media and from mainstream media platforms than there was in Sabina's death. And within 6 days, they'd already arrested someone on the suspicion of her death. Now, Sabina's been missing for 9 days now. None of that's happened. And I pretty much found out about Sabina's death from people making posts on Instagram or Twitter and stuff like that. So I just think it's important to highlight that the mainstream media and social media in general quite often fails to take notice when a woman of colour goes missing or is murdered for that matter. Another thing that I think is quite interesting that the story points out is it points out that a lot of the time when these attacks on women happen, communities rally together to educate women on how they can better protect themselves, but that's not what we should be teaching women. You need to teach men to stop being toxic and stop trying to kill women and stop abusing women. The lesson isn't here for women to be like, right, I got to go take a taekwondo class so I know how to attack a man if he stops me on the street. That's bullshit. That is not it. You should teach your sons from a very young age how to respect women and not dwell into toxic masculinity. And that's that.
I have nothing more to say. What's next up on the news stories?
So the next story is quite short, and it's from our good old independent media partner, The Canary. Now, it says European truck drivers won't move to the UK for just 3 months. The story is basically just a summary of experiences from European truck drivers. Now, the reason I've picked it is simply for the fact that this country is trying to implement a lot of anti-immigration policies. You even mentioned just now the deportation flights and stuff like that. But yet all of a sudden, now that we've got truck drivers shortages, we're like to immigrants, oh, please come over here for 3 months, just 3 months, uplift your whole life for 3 months, come over here so you can help us out. And I think it just goes to highlight just how selfish this government is. And yeah, so that's why I picked it, because it's bullshit.
Yeah, do you know what? The government's bullshit. That's why we're here at The World Transformed, to look at ways in which we can change this world, we can transform the world to make it a better place, and so that we can continue doing that. Hit that donate button. Come on. Hit that donate button, people. You know what it is. Right, listen, guys, we've got a lot on the show today. First of all, we've got a special guest. There is an event coming up at the festival, and we are very, very privileged to have Benny Wender, who is here to tell us a little bit about his story and about the event that will be happening in about 20 minutes' time. So, Benny, if you want to come on up here, and everyone, please give Benny a big round of applause. Hey, hey, hey! And if the gallery could just let us know if Benny's microphone isn't on. Benny, do you want to say hello?
Just do it.
Hello. Hello.
Wicked. I can't hear anyone telling me that it's not working. Benny, thanks so much for joining us here. I know you've had a busy day. You're here to tell us your story, a bit more about the campaign that you're involved in regards to New Papua. So first of all, like, you know, tell us a little bit about your story, what it is that you're doing, why you're here today, and what you're going to be telling people in the big tent in a moment.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm come from West Papua. West Papua is north of Australia in the Pacific. You know that Pacific is made up of the Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia. So I'm from the Melanesian. So I'm here. 16 years ago, I escaped from prisons. I came this country, and this is not accident, but firstly, I settled in Brighton first place. So I'm just come back this place, and I'm glad. So the story is, you know, people of West Papua fighting for the colonialism, imperialism. Currently, Indonesia occupied our country, killing my people, almost 500,000. It's not only political campaign, but also our environments, your survivals, because West Papua is second largest of islands in the world, and covered is second biggest rainforest in West Papua. But now Indonesia illegally occupied and destroy our environment, particularly logging company. In fact, there is BP and Freeport McMoran that are operating in middle of the genocide in West Papua. That's why I'm, you know, privileged to be here to tell my story, what really happening, what really going on in West Papua.
Thanks so much, Benny. And, you know, I've read up on your story. It's some of the stuff in there, you know, I had to read it twice just to really actually take it in. I had to take a moment after reading it. So really appreciate you coming to tell your story, and understand that it must take a lot from you, not just like physically, but mentally. And so I really do encourage people, if you can, to look up the campaign, and specifically about the campaign. You've got offices here in the UK. If you could just tell us, like, how people can get more information, and how they can get involved and support what you're doing in regards to what's happening in West Papua.
Yes, website called Free West Papua campaign, based in Oxford, and this office is in Netherlands, in Australia, and in South Africa. They're campaigning to support West Papua, because our fight is, as mentioned, is not only political, but our environment being destroyed, because West Papua is a lung of the world. So when you support West Papua, that means preserve the planet Earth, because we need to save our natural, environment, as well as the people, because Indonesia is committed genocide, not only my people, but all our environment, all being in West Papua. When you support West Papua, mean you save the planet.
Yeah, that's. I think that's the beautiful thing with the story, is that there's so many strands to exactly what you're trying to do. You talk about the planet, but also it's just the level of humanity and the fact that, you know, internationally we need more people to be aware of what's going on so that we can pressure governments and world leaders to actually sit up, listen and take notice. So a lot of credit to you. We've got a lot of respect and massive appreciation for coming here today. I know you've got to be in the big tent in a moment on stage, so we will let you get on. I know you've got to get on. So
thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. If you do want to check it out, you can also go to Benny Wenda, that's BENNYWENDA.org. You check out that website. He's on Twitter, he's on Facebook, probably got way more followers than me, so follow me after you checked him out. But Benny, thank you so much. I hope it all goes well on the main stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's what TWT is about. It is about actually getting stories of people from across the world and looking at how we can make the world a better place. If you want to see more of it, what do they got to do, Claudia?
Support, subscribe, follow, do all of the above.
You know what it is.
And donate.
Donate. Give us your money. If you can, give us your money. Please do.
Please. We'll take it.
Another group of people that are out there trying to make the world a better place is our very good friends at Trademark Belfast. And we have got Stevie from Trademark Belfast inside the house. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, slam the floor. Come on, if you're at your keyboard, hit the keyboard. You know what it is. What's happening, Stevie? I'm good, man. I'm good.
Whichever you pick your
you.
favourite, pick your poison.
You feeling good?
Yeah, I'm a bit tired.
Had a good day?
Late night.
Late night.
Early morning.
Why did everyone party but me?
Because you wasn't here. Was you in the big tent with us last night?
No, I was in a little pub around the corner.
Wow,
Yeah.
that sounds terrible.
It was. No, it was all right. It was all right. It was good company.
I've definitely taken a chill today, but I brought the energy for this afternoon. Claudia came along. She brought a bit of energy. That South London
glad I
vibe.
did.
It is what it is. Now, Trademark Belfast, for the people who don't know, I'll tell you what, Stevie, you do it, because I'll probably do a disservice to you. What's the story behind Trademark Belfast? Who are you? What do you do? Why do you do it?
We're the official anti-sectarian unit of the Irish Labour movement, so our role has been in the peace process for the last 25 years. Most of that is about conflict intervention in workplaces when workers are getting threatened by paramilitaries or state security forces. We also do a lot of work with ex-prisoners and ex-paramilitaries, a lot of mediation, a lot of community organisation, community education. And then in 2008, with the global financial crash, we were approached by people, as others were everywhere, saying, what the fuck just happened? Can you please explain it? And we said, we'll do our best. And since then, we've done a line, quite a good line, if I say so myself, in political education. The one thing that's absent from the Irish Labour movement, and particularly from the British Labour movement, and perhaps even the British left generally, is good political education. So that's what we do, and that's why we're here, because we do a lot of work now in Britain as well as in Ireland.
Could you tell us a bit more about the work that you do in Britain? Because on the website, obviously, there's quite a lot about what's going on in Northern Ireland. But what is it you're doing in Britain?
Well, we're members of Unite. That's my union, have been for 25 years. And as you know, Unite organises in Ireland, even though it's a British-based union. So we've got quite a unique view in the sense that we work all across Ireland, north and south, but we also work in Britain through the union. So through Unite and through other unions we work with here, they invited us over after 2008 to do political economy work with their members. Members wanted to know why their lives were shit, what was austerity, where did it come from, what was happening in the City of London, what caused the financial crash. And the union movement wasn't doing it, wasn't explaining to members why they were in the situation. They're still not doing it, I would argue. We're not necessarily very good at what we do, but we're the only people fucking doing it. So that's the issue. So we're a big fish in a very small pond. And the union movement's got massive capacity, loads of resources, and it's not putting them in the right places, particularly in terms of political education.
When you talk about political education, especially like around the economy and stuff, you know, what does that mean to the everyday worker? Because, you know, don't get me wrong, I used to work in a call centre, in a bank as well, right? And you come and start talking to me about political education. I say to you, dust out with yourself unless you're going to give me a pay rise, my don. Do you know what I mean? So, what does that mean, political education? I don't care, unless you got a pay rise for me. So how do you relate that to someone like me, say?
Well, normally we don't work with unions unless they give us their members for 3 or 4 days. And we always say that if you come into our political school on a Monday and you're a little bit annoyed about the world, by the time you leave on a Wednesday, you're going to be fucking livid. And that's our job, is to explain what's happening to them in detail. We don't use academic language, we don't use academic terms, but we explain the history of capitalism, slavery, we explain where white supremacy comes from, the role of British imperialism, which we were doing yesterday here at TWT. I have to admit, that was good fun. The role of the British Labour Party in British imperialism, the role of the British Labour Party in imperialism in Ireland, which, you know, within the Labour Party in Britain, there's not much political education around those things. So a lot of young activists come in 2015, for instance, and joined the party. It was only after that, more recently, they found out what kind of party they've joined. So political education is important. You have to understand, you know, where we come from, where the system comes from, if we're going to change it and move beyond it, you know. So you'd have to just come and sit on one of our political schools. I can't. If you want me to deliver it now, I can. I'm happy. Just give me a flip chart and a pen, and I'll go for it. You know.
Oh, go right ahead.
I like your style, you know, just like, you know what, I'll rock up and I will political educate anyone you give me.
Anyone, anytime, anywhere. Absolutely,
You know,
yeah.
It's really important that you mentioned is the idea of not like using like jargon or like big words, because I think a lot of people obviously who are interested in political education but hear someone just use a big word, they're just like, yep, nope, can't do it anymore. So it is really important to kind of bring it down the level for people.
Well, we used to be good at this. The trade union movement and political activism used to be good at political education, and we're not anymore. And it's kind of drifted off into the academy, into academia, where now it's the preserve of experts, the preserve of the middle classes. Let's be honest about it. And we used to have thousands of people, working class people, who could explain finance capital, who could explain to people what goes on in the city of London. We don't have those people anymore. Gramsci called them organic intellectuals, people that knew from experience, and then they read the theory, and then they understood the theory. Why? Because they'd experienced it. We don't do that anymore, which is why, again, we're a tiny organisation. We've got, you know, we're not well resourced, but we've been asked to do lots of work over here only because no one else is really doing it. Not no one's doing it, you're doing it, TWT is doing it, but still it's quite rare to come across good political education, you know?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, especially being here, is as an Englishman, or, well, my family would say Scouse, not English, but, you know...
Me?
No, me.
Oh,
me.
I was about to get up and walk out there.
No. My family's all Scouse. I got a big
I'm South London. I'm born in Clapham, raised in Brixton, but I went to...
These two are going to get on now. The show's just going to...
I'm tooting, he's Clapham. That's all we can talk about.
I might as well go home. I'm
See you
cancelled.
later.
But no, a London-Irish background, so we all moved back to Ireland when I was a teenager. I've still got this accent, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it sticks with you, doesn't it?
South London does not leave you.
When I speak Irish, I have an Irish accent, so that's all that matters.
But the big thing is, you know, for a lot of people here in England, you know, when we see in the media, when they talk about what's going on in Northern Ireland specifically, they talk about it as if it's some distant land far away. Yeah, like you don't realise how close it is, and actually how much of an impact our history has had on what's going on right now. Do you have Trademark Belfast, have any resources or any advice for our viewers, like on where we can learn more and we can actually take some information and start to educate the people around us? Because, like you said before, you know, alongside the British government, the British media, mainstream media, bullshit.
Yeah, and we were talking about that yesterday. Whenever I speak to anyone from Britain, particularly the British left, whenever they look west, they just see New York and that island that's in between here and there kind of disappeared, and they know nothing about its language, its culture, its history, which is really weird when you consider how close it is and the intertwined nature of the two countries' relationships for 800 years. Now, the reason no one knows anything about it is because we have a colonial relationship and an imperialist relationship, and the metropolitan centre of empire doesn't need to fucking know about the periphery or its colonies. It just needs to make sure that the profits and the labour and the resources comes in. Whereas the periphery and the colonies, and people here know this, you have to know everything about the mothership. You know, it's language. I mean, in Ireland we speak fucking English all the time. Yeah. You know, so there's a huge issue for the left in Britain as well. Like, the left is really good on Cuba here, even the Labour Party. It's good on Venezuela. It's good on Palestine. It's shit on Ireland. Yeah. It almost has no opinion on Ireland, and there's a real like myopia in the British left about Ireland. I understand why, the troubles, the conflict, the IRA campaign here and so on, but there's a responsibility on the British left to have a better position on Ireland, like, you know?
Now, the big question for everyone when they come on the Twt TV show is, how can people get involved? How can they learn more?
How can they support you?
Yeah, what can they do to support you?
Don't have to support us. We're all right, but we have an excellent podcast called Trademark Belfast, The Worker's Guide to Everything. We've been running that for a couple of years, and it's basically a podcast version of all our political education work. We do the history of capitalism. The latest series is a series called What the Fuck is the Stock Market and What the Fuck is it for? And it's an introduction for anybody to understand what they're doing in the City of London and why it matters, as you said earlier, why that matters to workers. And we show the link between the speculation and the gambling that's happening in the stock market and and why people's lives are getting worse. And will continue to get worse unless we change it.
I'm subscribing. Do you know what? I might take that line and use it. What the fuck is Keir Starmer? Anyway, listen, Stevie, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure.
Do you want to plug your socials or anything?
Yeah.
You a TikToker?
Me, a TikTok? Do I look like a fucking TikToker?
Well,
you'd be surprised at the people you see on TikTok now, you know?
I know.
Get on TikTok, it might work.
Yeah, that's about double that. We at Trademark BF is our Twitter feed, and Trademark Belfast on Facebook. That's as far as we've gone so far regarding social media. I think TikTok's just a little bit beyond me.
Claudia, hook him up with a TikTok after this,
All right,
yeah?
cool. I'll give you the TikTok training.
Thank you so
No
much.
worries,
Really
pleasure.
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
it. And I hope you have a great time here at the festival. Now, guys, come on. Yes. Energy all day, every day, everywhere. You know what it is. Listen, if you are watching at home, we're going to remind you again, follow us, TWT_now. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and now we're on TikTok. Hey. Yeah, we're all over the place. We have our own podcasts. We've now got our own TV show, and we want to keep it going. So what do they got to do?
Like, comment, share, subscribe, donate, support, all of the lot.
All of them things, all of them days, all of them times, you know what it is. Now, listen up, guys. We need you to hold on the line for just a couple of minutes while we switch over to the TWT and Left Book Club Anti-Capitalism and Violence session. That is about to start, is about to stream on your screens within the next 6 minutes and 30 seconds. See, man,
So
doing
specific.
times. Trust me. That's how good we are. We get specific times out here, mainly because of the person that's not in my ear. Anyway, we're going to put on a holding card now. You're going to see some nice colors and our logo and stuff. So this is a perfect opportunity for you to go to, get your pen and paper or a new browser open, theworldtransformed.org, and go to donate, hit support, and become a monthly subscriber to the World Transformed. Support the team, big up the people. Gallery guys, if you want to put the holding card on, we'll get set up for the next stream. Peace, love, see you in an hour.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this World Transformed and Left Book Club event. Tonight, or today, wherever you are, we'll be discussing anti-capitalism and violence with some really incredible guests. We're actually really happy we've pulled this off, and so we're very happy wherever you're joining us, and that we're all under this one, I want to say virtual roof, but I think it's kind of a hybrid virtual roof. So thank you very much. My name is Elif, and I take care of the political education program of the Left Book Club. That's how I'm coming to you today. I want to talk a little bit about the Left Book Club before we introduce our session. The Left Book Club is a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We publish collectible editions of radical and progressive books, which are uniquely available to members and posted out each month. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education, aiming to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. So throughout particularly last year, Left Book Club events have featured some phenomenal speakers. So feel free to check out our video library on the Left Book Club YouTube channel, and of course subscribe if you haven't already to the World Transformed YouTube channel as well. Tonight, don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream throughout the session. And if you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member. Don't forget to follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with our events, promotions, and giveaways. And of course, also do that for the World Transformed socials as well. Just a very quick technical reminder: if the stream for whatever reason goes choppy, please stay with us. It will be up and running in no time. Before I introduce the event, I also want to remind everyone watching us that the Left Book Club has a World Transformed promo. So if you use TWT 2021, you get 10% off any subscription and a free Socialism and Barbarism tote bag. So go and sign up now. A little bit about tonight's event before I pass over to our incredible Gagi. So this is a part of a popular anti-capitalism series that the Left Book Club has been putting on. Tonight's session is the 7th session in this series, titled Anti-Capitalism and Violence. And the series came about because in September 2020, the government announced, along with many other so-called anti-extremist measures, that anti-capitalist education material will no longer be allowed in English classrooms and were dubbed, quote-unquote, extremist. And so we developed this series to discuss anti-capitalism in various different capacities and related to, of course, various different areas. So tonight's one will be anti-capitalism and violence. We'll be discussing some of the questions around, what is the relationship between capitalism and violence, and particularly within the section of discussion around resistance, struggle, and also armed struggle. We have with us today, of course, Gagi Bhattacharya, who is one of the UK's leading scholars on race and capitalism. She is the author of Rethinking Capitalism, Dangerous Brown Men, Traffic, and the co-author of Empire's Endgame. We also have with us today, and we're very glad that Vron can join us, is Vron Ware, who is a British academic and professor at Kingston University. She was editor of Searchlight magazine from 1981 to 1983 and worked as a freelance journalist until 1987, where she co-founded the Women's Design Service. She has taught cultural geography at the University of Greenwich, and taught various different subjects in various different universities. Over the past 25 years, Vron has been one of a small number of scholar activists pioneering the study of race and culture in contemporary Britain, beginning with the publication of a pamphlet on women and the National Front in 1978. In 1987, Ware co-founded the Women's Design Service, as we said. with Sue Kavanagh and Wendy Davis. The organisation believed that cities needed to be radically altered to suit women's needs. The group put out a publication to create women's bathroom facilities to better suit women's needs, like diaper changing areas and so on. Anyways, they'll probably be part of some parts of the discussion as well. We also have with us today Chris Rostel, who lectures in Pace at the University of Warwick. His research focuses on international political theory and the political philosophy of resistance, with a particular focus on militarism and anti-militarism. He has published in International Political Sociology, Millennium, and in 2014 was awarded the Bisson Michael Nicholson Thesis Prize. And Robert Knox, I know you also prefer some people to call you Rob, so Rob is joining us today. He is a senior lecturer in law at the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool, and is an editor of Historical Materialism Journal and the London Review of International Law. His research analyses the interconnection between imperialism, process of racialization, and international institutions. So without further ado, I would like to start introducing Gagi. We've done these events for the past 7 months on various different subjects, and we are really excited that we're putting on this event, particularly at the World Transform, because one of the reasons why we started doing this event, as I said, was of course about education, but also to discuss some of the very under-discussed, understudied, and understood areas, particularly within the left. And one of those is particularly a discussion around violence. There's been a focus on peaceful protests and so on, and to kind of try and explore why that is and what that means for developing a perspective for the left to understand these as well. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Gagi, who will be the main discussant of this event. And thank you very much for joining us.
Right, thanks so much, Aleph. I hope if anyone's ever been here before, it's the first time I've ever been in a room with Aleph to do this, so it's a bit kind of overexciting for both of us. Oh, I can see you across the room. I've never had that before. Predictably, we're having a little bit of trouble keeping the connection with our speakers, so I will begin and start to talk a little bit about why this topic is so exciting for us to do. I'm hoping that the connection to the speakers is going to come back very soon. When we started to think about the anti-capitalism series, one of the things we wanted to do was to both remember longer-standing debates in anti-capitalism and to reposition those debates about anti-capitalism in how we all do our politics and think about our solidarity with comrades across the world. So we really thought that the question of violence, although perhaps for a while in the global north we haven't always thought about violence alongside anti-capitalism, is one that we wanted to think about. Both the violence of the capitalist state, the ways in which capitalism is already not only dehumanising but barbarous and bloodthirsty and deadly violence for all too many, but also the ways in which those structures of violence get institutionalised and embodied, and then how we think about our collective attitudes to different forms of violence as resistance, or how we position ourselves alongside violence. And people are moving on my screen, so that's so exciting. So, as you don't want to not come here to hear from me, I think I should move on to our speakers, and I wonder if Chris wouldn't mind beginning. I think each of our speakers is going to do a brief opening, and then again, for people who've come before, then we have a kind of conversation. So please, Chris, do begin.
Thanks a lot, Gagi. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this conversation all weekend. So you asked us a bunch of questions, and one was to think about the relationship between militarism, war, and capitalism, but one was to think through questions of anti-militarist solidarity and its relationship to violence and non-violence. And so I've been writing lately about the lessons that we can take thinking about war and militarism and racial capitalism from the Black Panther Party. So I've been looking at how the Black Panther Party understood those concepts and their relationship, but I've also been looking at how the Black Panther Party interacted with the more white-dominated peace movements of its day, because I think you've got some interactions and some conflicts there that have quite useful lessons for thinking about these relationships. So I'm going to kind of tell a couple of those stories very quickly as a way of setting some of that up. Now, the Panthers, as I think lots of people will know, had a kind of a very strong account of how capitalism underpins war and violence. You know, they had a very careful focus on the ways that capitalism's relentless drive for accumulation and relentless need to discipline labor and open markets would mean that it would always produce war and militarism, that these are kind of endemic, almost necessary features of capitalism, and that you shouldn't try to understand these things outside of capitalism. And for that reason, Huey Newton and others saw the peace movement that was going on, the anti-Vietnam War movement, as really important. They thought if capitalism relies on these wars, if you can stop these wars from happening, you strike a real blow at the kind of the capacity of capitalism to keep functioning. So they saw the peace movement as a really important potential site of revolution, or instigator of revolution. But they were also really critical of the kind of white-dominated peace movement. And they were critical of it because it draws certain distinctions that they saw were very racial distinctions. So the fact that the peace movement would call for the troops to leave Vietnam, but wouldn't call for the troops or, you know, the police and the National Guard to leave Detroit, to leave Newark, that the peace movement wasn't particularly concerned with kind of
Okay, we seem to have lost Chris briefly there, which is really sad. And have we lost everybody for the moment?
For them, they kind of break apart some of the distinctions between war and peace, between the international and domestic that we might think about. So for me, they had a really kind of powerful critique of that movement. But what I want to talk about briefly right now is two alliances they formed with white-dominated movements in that context. And they formed these really interesting alliances. First with an organization called the Peace and Freedom Party, which was a kind of quite middle-class anti-war party operating mainly in California. And they put together an alliance strong enough that Eldridge Cleaver, one of the main figures in the Panthers, ran as Peace and Freedom Party candidate for president. But the alliance didn't really work, and part of the reason the alliance didn't really work is that the kind of middle-class anti-war activists of the Peace and Freedom Party were really uncomfortable being associated with Black Panther Party militancy. They were really uncomfortable because what they thought the best strategy for an anti-war politics is to get middle-class whites on board and try and change the conversation from there. So and then the second alliance they formed is with the Students for a Democratic Society. And this almost has the opposite problem. The Students for a Democratic Society were a young and much more radical anti-war socialist organization. And the Students for a Democratic Party were way too excited about Black Panther Party militancy. So at a point in 1969, when the Panthers tried to scale back some of their more militant politics and put emphasis on the community programs that they were running, the Breakfast for School program, the health programs, and so forth, the Students for a Democratic Society didn't like that at all. Some of them split off. This is where the Weather Underground got going. You got this real rejection of the Panthers because they didn't quite fit up to a particular understanding of what militancy should mean. So you've got these two things going on. And then elsewhere, there's this really interesting letter that appears from Daniel Berrigan. Daniel Berrigan was a Catholic priest who was one of the people who set up the Ploughshares movement. He was a pacifist, but he was a pacifist who spent a good amount of time high up on the FBI's most wanted list for carrying out sabotage of military institutions. So he was a very active pacifist. And he writes this really the Weather Underground so dominated, and he criticizes the Weather Underground, and he says the violence that you're using is going to only be counterproductive. Like, you're going to scare people off who are attracted to our cause. If we want to achieve our goals, we need to use a letter where he says, now I'm writing as a white person writing to white people. I'm not talking about the violence that's being used by the Black Panther Party or the Viet Cong. I don't think we can even call that violence. So there's that, like, in the middle of this very passionate pacifist track, there's a very surprising call to see violence as something you can only really attend to in context. It doesn't make sense to call that violence. It's a really interesting moment. So, the question that we were asked about whether anti-militarism has to be non-violent, and about whether or not you can oppose militarism while being in solidarity with those who are engaged in armed struggle, is, for me, those stories are ones that tell us that it's quite hard to answer those questions in the abstract. The Peace and Freedom Party show us that you can be a kind of pacifist organization that's still very entrenched in a kind of racist respectability politics that I think we should understand as a form of violence. And the Students for a Democratic Society example shows us that solidarity with armed struggle can be really fetishistic. It can actually be more about fantasies of militant solidarity than actual practical solidarity. And the Berrigan example shows us that violence isn't necessarily something you can think of in context. I really like that Berrigan letter. I'm generally quite suspicious of the role of non-violence as an organizing structure in movements, and I'm happy to talk about that a bit in the discussion. But for me, these are questions that you need to think about in context. Abstract answers can kind of get quite slippery in a sense. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Chris. And they were such really excellent examples and so close to what we want to do. For everyone at home, sadly, you'll hear that we're sometimes getting speakers cut out a little bit. Please do bear with us. Chris got back, but we had a few tiny gaps. I'm hoping that Rob will go next, if that will be okay.
Yes, that's okay. It's going to be a bit difficult to follow Chris. So I'll go through my notes. I'll kind of respond a bit to Chris and then think about, some next stuff that we might say. So I really think that one of the things that Chris brought out very well, and a thing that honestly sounds obvious maybe to some people, but I think has become less obvious as time's gone on, is this kind of deep kind of structural necessity of various forms of violence to like capitalist society. So if we look at a lot of contemporary intellectual production quite recently, there has been this really quite strong reassertion of the idea of capitalism as kind of civilizing, as kind of moving away from violence. And this comes not just from the right, but also from the left. So the idea that there's a shift in capitalism from forms of direct violence to forms of economic competition as this kind of new regulating factor. And we see this in various ways across the spectrum. And so I really think that Chris is right to insist that actually this is simply not correct. And if we look at the logic of the way that capitalism functions, violence is endemic to it in a way that it has never been endemic to other kind of historical societies and systems. And that is partly because capitalism is always founded upon forms of violent, racialized dispossession. That's the kind of the core of the history of capitalism. And also that the nature of capitalist production processes are constant forms of expansion, constant forms of disciplining, which means that when you have this and you have resistance, you will need violence, right? And a lot of us will know that even when that violence is not explicit, it is always implicit. So behind the IMF is always someone holding a gun being well, if you don't do this, well, then there's going to be an invasion or whatever. And so I think it's really important to keep on insisting on that basic fact of the centrality of violence to capitalism, but also that capitalism specifically needs violence in a continuous way, in a way in which maybe other kind of historical modes of organizing economies have not. And it is very much a core part of it, even when it appears that it doesn't. And I think that is really important because one of the things that you see a lot now in the contemporary left, and I think it was important for Chris to raise some races to Black Panther Party, is, for instance, this attempt to dissociate the criticism of, let's say, racism from the criticism of militarism. So this idea that what you can do is be an anti-racist at home, but you can also abroad be well, let's just bomb X, Y, or Z place. But actually, probably one of the primary ways in which forms and practices of racism and racialization happen in contemporary capitalism is through forms of militarism and forms of violence. And those forms of militarism and violence rebound back into what you think of as the domestic sphere. So Gagi has worked on this too, but the idea that you could understand one of the most important contemporary forms of racism in Britain, Islamophobia, without understanding the international context in which that was articulated, is a complete non-starter and a misnomer. So censoring this kind of role of violence and the critique of violence, both as a domestic and an international thing, is really important for the left understanding the way in which capitalism works and how to oppose it. Now, linked to that is a second kind of like, I think this is kind of it sounds like an instrumentalist point, but I think it's probably worth making, which is that people will often be like, well, if only we could just stop talking about this war stuff, we could get back to talking about factories and wages and stuff like that. But actually, if you look at the history of like the most powerful left-wing mobilizations, the critique of militarism has always been central to them. So if we look in the kind of our classic moments of like the Bolsheviks and all these other revolutionary moments in Europe, what they are connected to is a critique of the First World War, and that critique lets them link together a whole bunch of disparate issues, colonialism, racism, capitalism, into a coherent set of political interventions, which then help them build a movement. And we could go through this at various points in various ways. We could look at Vietnam, we could look at like Iraq, and we can kind of see the ways in which this happens. And what's crucial, I think, in terms of like a left-wing understanding of violence in this way, is understanding the specificity and the specific role that violence plays in capitalism, and how capitalism continuously generates that in a way that other things don't. I think that's really important because what it does is it lets us critique and differentiate between a certain kind of vulgar pacifism and what might be a left-wing approach to violence. That vulgar pacifism essentially just treats violence as this big, homogenous lump of badness, where it's like, this is violence, it is bad. And it doesn't understand the ways in which violence is not undifferentiated, it's generated in different ways by different forces and in different manners. And if we understand that there is this very deep structural interconnection between capitalism and certain modes of violence, we understand that overcoming violence is not simply a matter of everyone being nice or shaking hands or whatever. It is instead looking at those deeper rooted social and economic relations, those drivers of the way in which violence works, and saying like, well, what do we do about them? How do we target them? How do we dismantle them? And these things are sufficiently deep rooted, of course, that realistically, something like violence, is probably going to be needed to disrupt them. It will be certainly experienced by the people that are invested in these systems as violence, where they are removed from forms of control and power, and they will resist in that way. So at least on some level, that appears very necessary. And it's important to say, in that respect, even your most respectable left-wing reformist is planning on taking over a state which articulates huge forms of violent power and will almost definitely have a military in that way. There is no way out of thinking about politics in whatever sense with violence. And I think then, to kind of dovetail with what Chris is saying, I think this also means that violence doesn't just become a matter of context, it becomes a matter of tactics. Now, there is a very strong thing about non-violence, which is essentially in the contemporary world order, in many, many contexts, violence is just a stupid thing to do. The Black Panther Party found out themselves there came a certain point where if they go to war with the state won that war because they had a couple of guns and the state had the state. But that's a tactical decision, and it's not a decision based on a principle which doesn't disaggregate various forms of violence. So I think that viewed in that context, I then just want to very briefly just say a little bit about the thing that I am most interested in, the thing I work on and what I'm most interested in, is what I do, which is this attempt by certain people to say that and this is a very common move for a kind of more a pragmatic attempt to kind of have a pacifist kind of non-violent approach, which is to be if we can simply have law regulating violence, or we can turn to law instead of violence, this is politics that will be both respectable and effective. Now, I have lots and lots of problems with this, but I think there is a few crucial things here which we might want to think about in the context of thinking about violence and non-violence. So the first is that law often presents itself as if it limits violence, but the way that states and other actors approach law is not as limiting violence, but as enabling violence. States will tend to see any kind of supposed restriction on the use of violence, not as you can't do this, but specifying the conditions in which they can do it. And then states will use that as a way of articulating their violence within categories and languages which can legitimate it. The classic example internationally very recently, is that George W. Bush had this kind of cavalier attitude towards law. People got pissed off at him. Barack Obama basically took all of the same set of arguments that Bush did, but he got lawyers to come out on stage, justify what they were doing, and suddenly what was criticized as violence was now understood as murkier, much more lawful, and things like that. And that links, I think, to another thing that we wanted to think about, which is that transformations in contemporary forms of violence and this move towards more distant, disarticulated forms of violence, say in the forms of drones and things like this, is a tactic that states have used to avoid that critique. So that's England. The second important point, I think, is that that critique, and indeed pacifism generally, is in a strange way an attempt to depoliticize violence. It's an attempt to take violence, cast it outside of forms of political contestation, and just say, well, no, we don't have to have this as a political thing. It's like everyone can oppose violence because we have this common set of agreements. But of course, when we're thinking about resistance movements, we suddenly understand, no, these forms of violence and counter-violence are not apolitical. They are deeply politicized and based on questions of who can use force in what way, for what purpose. And because of that, this kind of turn to law, loop full circle, takes us away from this original insight, which is that if we understand violence is generated in particular kind of social and economic relations, we also understand that forms of counter-violence can be in some sense judged and supported insofar as what they are doing is attacking those relations which are giving rise to those forms of violence in the first place. And a crucial thing that we always have to think about in this context is not, is this violent, is this not violent, but what is the basis of this violence? What is the direction of travel? And therefore, what is the political project that we do? So this is a crucial thing about understanding that relationship between violence and struggle and like transformation. And also in kind of, because I'm just going to bring it back to law again, that problem of this kind of seductive legal mobilization against violence, which cuts against those kind of things. I'll just leave it there and we can just pick up some stuff in the chat.
Oh, thank you so much. You covered so much of the ground that we hope to have in this event. So I'm going to move quickly on. I should say I'm so exceptionally excited to have Ron on the programme. I mean, it's lovely to have Chris and Rob, but I feel especially, and I think they probably both feel like, I'm on a panel with Ron Ware. So thank you so much for giving up some of your Sunday evening, and please make your contribution before we have the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for setting me up like that. And so just thinking about what you just said, Rob, the fact that today is the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, you see these things, you think about the amount of work that's gone into making that a thing, but then you think, well, actually, what does that mean? It means a whole lot of stuff, which we can't go into here. But I think it's important to note that that is actually today. So I wanted to really start somewhere else and to begin by saying why now is a particularly good time to be thinking about war and militarism and how it affects us where we live. So the first reason is because this country's just lost a war, right? Sometimes you ask those questions when a country's just won a war, like, for example, the Falklands or the Malvinas War in 1982, or the first Gulf War, when a number of political initiatives were developed to really respond to the idea that this was a big victory. So the UK just really lost a war in the sense of after 20 years of military deployment, they were kind of very undignified and sort of a humiliating way forced to pack up and leave with total chaos. And the enemy that they were fighting for those 20 years was sort of reinstalled as the government without really any, there were shots fired and there was a lot of violence. But it was a very sort of hectic, strange process, which was seen as symbolically a sort of defeat of the West. So this moment, I think, is a very important time to be thinking about how we understand war, what we understand by militarism. What was that 20 years? What happened? How was our societies distorted? Someone mentioned Islamophobia, how you cannot understand that in a sort of social, cultural, political context at home without understanding what was going on in terms of foreign policy and war. Well, there we have it. There are young people who have not, who were not old enough to understand why the British Army was sent to Afghanistan in 2001, and then again in 2006. They don't know what ISAF is. They just knew that it was something to do with protecting women or allowing girls to go to school. There's a lot of work to be done then. And I'm not saying that the war is over, as Paul Rogers would say. Actually, this is we're moving into the third decade of a 30-year-old war already. So the second reason why it's important is this business about global Britain and this sort of posturing on a world stage that global Britain is back, we've got our sovereignty, and we're going to be a world player. Completely ridiculous. What does it mean? How do we know it's going on? Well, this huge flotilla left Portsmouth in May, and there was very little publicity, actually. I mean, it was partly the same time as the airstrikes on Gaza, but I think also, despite the fact that there were BBC journalists on board who were actually doing the Today programme from the flotilla, and actually there was that incident in the Crimea subsequently, but also BBC journalists on board. It kind of, there was a massive amount of hardware went with this flotilla. There was like the HMS Queen Elizabeth, a huge number of fighter jets and things. The whole business of having jets but no carrier to. They're American jets, US jets with no carrier that can actually take them and all that kind of stuff. And the Marines were part of it. It's symbolizing the special relationship with the US going into Indochina, the so-called Indo-Pacific tilt, all these new jargon that come up. So that's happened in May. And then, of course, we have the new agreement with Australia and the US and the UK to build nuclear submarines and sort of ditch the contract that they'd made with France. What the hell is going on there, and what does this mean at this moment in time? We also saw in March the integrated review, which was the government sort of, the long-awaited declaration of what the foreign policy, what the defence policy was going to do, what it was going to be. If anyone looked at it, one of the interesting things was that they sort of promoted the idea that we no longer have war and peace, that was all outdated. There's a blurring of all the lines between things that we'd kept apart. So now they didn't use the phrase endless war, they used the phrase persistent engagement. So the idea is everything's blurred, nothing's very clear, and the real problems really exist in cyberspace and also outer space. So we moved into different dimensions now. They also talked about using economic methods they're blurring the economic methods of defence and foreign policy with military force. So that's all been going on over the last few months. There's a lot of things to kind of catch up on and pay attention to. So the third reason I would say why it's really important to have this conversation now is really because, we've seen a lot this summer, these incredible actions by Extinction Rebellion or Campaign Against the Arms Fair and, occupations of the Elbit Systems factory. And that's just in this country, lots of attempts to protest using classic non-violent methods and also very creative non-violent methods. And these movements, to some extent, have begun to speak to each other. We know about that. That's really important. But I think what we need to be really talking about is not just non-violence, but actually really understanding the history and politics of not pacifism, of movements that have used non-violent tactics. Now, both Chris and Rob talked about some of the historical stuff, and we can look at, for example, I mentioned the first Gulf War, the group of people who came together to think about how we might create a peace system. And again, that was in the US. A peace system that was in a city like Detroit, thinking about the armed violence against the youth of the city, thinking about how women were organizing to protect communities against the violence of the police, for example. So, these are some of the historical precedents. Or in 1983, there was a huge sort of feminist mobilization around the idea of non-violence, what that might mean, where was the violence coming from? Again, echoing some of the things that Rob has outlined. we do need to know these histories and to sort of animate them, bring them to life. But now, of course, we have the whole question of cyber warfare, and I think that does make things very, very different. So we can be very sophisticated in our understanding of violence, capitalism, anti-capitalism, and all these things, but we're facing a very different set of threats, which we've seen mounting this summer, and that's the growth of the far right and the alt-right, and the ease with which they've been able to mobilize around certain issues to do with COVID, as well as the sort of traditional themes that they have around race and the violence that's involved in that. So that's what I would really say. Those are the three reasons why we have to pay attention to where we are. And one more thing I would say is that pacifism is not about avoiding conflict. Pacifism and the politics of non-violence is absolutely not about not using violence or somebody mentioned being nice to your neighbour. It's absolutely not about that. It's embracing conflict. It's seeing conflict as a starting point for mobilising, moving, doing politics. But what we're against is the institution of war, the institution of armed violence. And that's the problem we're up against, because it's deeply economic now. The deals that they're making around nuclear submarines, not really to do with protecting us. They're signalling to China. There's a realignment of economic power. It's shutting, for example, the stuff around, the new agreements around the nuclear power stations in this country, making an agreement with China a few years ago. Now you're changing it and cutting them out and making an agreement with the US instead. There's a great realignment going, a huge global arms race happening. And what is that about? And I think that does sort of frame and shadow our conversations about what we do on the streets, and how we think about violence across all these different registers.
No, thank you so much. Some of the things that you were saying, which, as you say, also echo some of the things that Chris and Rob were saying, to me, because I am someone who's worked sometimes on the so-called war on terror, feels like a kind of terrible coming to fruition of that as a policy endeavour. In particular, the thing that you were pointing to, Vron, about the blurring of what is war. So no difference between war and peace. That's absolutely embedded in the cultural project of the war on terror, and the combining, I think even the combining of economic and more mainstream military means was already in that long war and set up as a kind of mode of foreign policy. But when I was talking to people about this event beforehand, one of the things that I find difficult to explain to people is how can we help people see militarism in British society today? I know there are attempts, it's probably being talked about in Labour Party conference across town, about let us have that Armed Forces Day some more, let's have an Armed Forces Week, let's do those things. But I still think, unless you live in very particular parts of the country that are very close to key institutionalised bit of the armed forces, Britain doesn't feel every day like a militarised society, and people's sense of, why are you banging on about militarism, even feels like the view. And I thought the thing that Bron was just saying about how previous generations of activists have sought to map systems of violence, or even the things about how the Black Panther Party tried to kind of map that, whether there are ideas or what your thoughts were about what would that look like for us to have that conversation with a wider set of people here today. I don't know if there's an order that someone wants to go first. Do you want to go first, Ron, yeah?
Yes. I mean, I once heard Cynthia Enloe say that if you felt that the world was a dangerous place, then you were on the way to being militarised. So I think the thing about militarism, I mean, one of the things I would say is that if you question people and you find that they have a kind of default, well, at a certain point you need military force to protect people, to, make sure their girls go to school, or whatever it is. You have an idea that somewhere there's a kind of good kind of military force that can solve a problem. But if you question the very idea that any political problem can be solved by force, then you can begin to understand how, that door isn't open. That door is always marked, okay, start here. You know, the guns start here, and we need the guns to threaten people to do certain things. But I think also the question of militarism, people don't really talk enough about how it runs through, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, theorists do, but there's a way in which it runs through our ideas about each other and about ourselves. So, for example, just to take an example that came up recently, a friend of mine whose father just died, you know, left a medal in the back of his cupboard. And in this family, my friend was a woman, but had a brother and various other sisters, and they all assumed that the brother would take the medal and look after it, even though the father had never talked about the medal and never mentioned it and had never done anything with it. So there was this assumption all the way around that this was what would happen naturally. So we're really questioning the sort of natural gender hierarchy, the ways in which we understand gender. Immediately, you're getting a long way from militarism, but you're deeply at the heart of it, actually.
No, absolutely. Yeah, Chris, have you saying that you'd like to say something?
Yeah, just building on that. Like when I saw the question that you put to us about, you know, how is militarism and violence like related to capitalism? Like, I think there are lots of ways, and we can talk about that. But I think it's also really important to be aware of the ways the military, and I think the assumption that they are has been one of the ways that violence and oppression are often imported into left-wing politics, by kind of saying that we can only understand kind of militarism and violence as something that makes sense within capitalism, such that if we oppose capitalism, we become in some ways innocent of the violence that takes place in the context of militarism, or like, as Ron is talking about, kind of gendered relations of violence and so forth. So I think like that there's a real need to hold both in that kind of conversation. I think I've been reading Priya Satia's book, Empire of Guns, which has quite a lot of things. And the book is a kind of a history of an early stage of development of the British arms trade. 16th, 17th century. And you know, one of her really interesting motifs is to look at the fact that there were a lot of Quakers involved in the early days of the arms trade. And she uses this as a means by which to think through the politics of responsibility, the kind of the development, how we developed a certain understanding of what it meant to be opposed to violence. And many of the Quakers who were involved in this nascent arms trade, who were expelled from the Quaker movement, but they responded by saying, well, lots of parts of the economy are really involved in putting together the weaponry that's used in Britain, you know, in the slave trade and imperial violence. Like, this is something that is occurring at an economic level. There's something problematic about isolating that in a particular space in history. And the book is great because the answer to that is, of course, that's a terrible response, but also an incredibly important and revealing response. But one of the really powerful arguments Satia makes through the book, which I hadn't thought about as much before, was probably unlike any other nation that has an arms trade. The arms trade has been absolutely central to Britain's place as a global power. Britain has never had the resource base, it's never had the population base to kind of expand in the way that it did. Much of the way Britain was able to grow so powerful was in its ability to circulate guns around the world. This was so formative to Britain's ability to grow as an imperial power. And that's a really important insight, because that's one of the ways in which Britain is able to maintain itself at a lesser but still incredibly important place within global militarism, is its comparative advantage in the circulation of weapons around the world. And, you know, the staying at the cutting edge of technology in terms of the ability to do that.
No,
at that context, there's a conversation to be had about kind of how militarism diffuses through society in terms of gender relations, in terms of understandings of nationhood. But there's also this aspect that is, you know, this material component of this ability to move guns and weaponry around the world that has this really long history in kind of maintaining Britain's imperial status. You don't need the biggest army if you can do that. You don't need the most resources, because it gives you so many forms of leverage and so forth.
No, I can see what you're saying. I just wondered that part of how I understood what you were saying, Rob, was that in many ways the veneer of law is there to give a disguise, you know, is to disguise militarism. And I wondered if you had any reflections on just this moment, this seems like such a disguised moment of militarism for British life to me, and that seemed to link to the things that you were saying, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, so I also have a response to the previous question, which I'll talk about. But so one of the things about, if you understand how the law works, especially the law around militarism, it always presupposes that a certain form of militarism is legitimate. Its starting point is, in every case, the use of military force is kind of prima facie legitimate, and then there are circumstances in which it will be illegitimate. So this is true both in terms of the legal regulations about the resort to war, but even more importantly, the legal regulations about how you use military violence. So if you look at the laws of war, as opposed to the law about when you go to war or not, all presuppose, you can use war, you can kill civilians, it's just that it has to be proportionate or whatever. So there's some really excellent critical work, which essentially says, well, if you start looking at it, this is actually a logical language of military efficiency, which is essentially don't use forms of inefficient violence, use forms of efficient violence. So all of these legal regimes that we're talking about, they presuppose forms of militarism as the normal state of affairs. And that's in part because, and it was really interesting that Ron was talking about the nuclear weapons stuff, because there is a very, this is going to be, so people can just switch off because it's really boring law shit, but there is a very specific thing, which is that there is an International Court of Justice case about the use of nuclear weapons. And what they ultimately end up saying is, look, we cannot say that this would not be allowed because international law has to let the state survive. That is the founding thing that international law is doing. And so the state might have to do this. So we think it's probably not lawful, but we're not going to come down and say it because we presuppose the ability of the state to survive. And as soon as you do that, which is the very premise of so much of legal regulation of violence, you are legitimating some form of militarism because that is inherent to the state system as it exists right now. So this is precisely right. And then I think the really important point linking things together is that this is very, very veiled, but that's in part exactly as Ron was talking about, because of the transformations in how militarism functions in contemporary societies, right? So the war on terror, I really think, and then the shift into the cyber stuff too, is really crucial in re-articulating and re-legitimating what military violence looks like. And this is one of the reasons why actually the withdrawal from Afghanistan is obviously in some respects a huge development, but in other respects it isn't, because the US maintains its ability to project its power into that region in various ways through the use of these kind of military technologies. Indeed, it's partly just a realignment and a rearticulation. So the law very much plays that function in terms of casting the legitimate times in which you can use militarism in a way that nonetheless doesn't impact on it. So there's a very, has any of you seen that video from 2011? It's the collateral murder video with the guys in the helicopter shooting the civilians, and they phone a lawyer and they're like, can we shoot this guy? And he's like, yeah, this looks like this is what law is doing, is entering into that function. But then in terms of the mapping of violence, what I think is really important, we can't reduce militarism and violence to capitalism, but we can say that insofar as we are trying to understand and grasp them, whilst of course violence is in part a product of people's psychological states, that's just, we can't say anything about that. But what we can say is that the resort to violence in particular context and how that's articulated is about social relations. That is the thing that we can understand that as being. And of course, violence predates and possibly will postdate capitalism. And we have to understand the ways in which different social arrangements reproduce different forms of violence and situate violence within different societies. I think that's really important. But I think we can say, and again, just going back to something that Chris said, that it is endemic to capitalism in a specific way in which it hasn't been before. And then part of the thing we can do is look at the way in which changing patterns of how capitalism has evolved and political alignments have happened, in which forms of violence have been articulated and legitimated across a whole historical period, right? Because we go from these larger, we get colonial violence in a very specific direct way. We get inter-European rivalry in the case of world wars. We get the Cold War, and we have moved towards forms of violence which merge with technology have a whole different way of doing things. The war on terror, again, is a very interesting example of this because it re-articulates violence as this kind of low-level mowing the lawn thing. That's what some of the guys refer to it as this just like continuous stream of low-level violence where it's like, well, these guys pop up, kill them, kill them, kill them, kill them. And I think we do have to understand the way in which that happens, in part because if we want to oppose those forms of violence, we need to understand how they've changed. The model that we used to oppose the Iraq war has to look very different to what we say about like these low-level interventions. There's no longer a spectacular moment that we can point to and be like, well, this is the bad thing to stop. It's much more of that thing going on. And I think that then, again, so this idea that there are then specific, I think we do have to pay attention. I think it's a very important point to say, Britain's international role is in part related to its role in the arms trade. I think another really important example of that would be the Israeli state, which is, it basically invents drone warfare. It invents technologies, contemporary technologies of militarism. And we need to pay attention to specific nodes within that. But that kind of way to understand that. And then to loop that back to the law stuff, that is really important. To look at how law is invoked or not invoked. Because then, just to close it, the very interesting example, right? The 1991 Gulf War, basically they had lawyers in the room for every single targeting decision. That's what they did. They brought the lawyers in, and the lawyers were like, yeah, okay, not okay, yeah, not okay. And that was a part of the US war, tackle that and understand how that has factored in to contemporary militarism to really get a grasp of what is going on.
No, thank you so much for that. I'm sorry, we're nearly out of time. Really, we are out of time, and I want to thank you all. But if it was possible to ask Ron one tiny thing, which really I could just ask her myself on Twitter, I guess, is I was really interested that you were saying, look, Britain is really aware of losing a war. And I wondered if there's just literally a 1 minute thing to just explain to us why that's such an important political lesson for us at this moment, or what we should be taking from that. Because I hadn't thought that people were saying it so openly till you said it. And it felt quite dangerous to me.
Well, the moment passed very quickly, but if you remember, there was quite a wobble even from some of the Tory ministers about the they blamed Biden for the way in which the withdrawal happened, even though it became clear. Remember the fuss about Dominic Raab being on holiday and everything? There was a sort of chaos at home as well as in Kabul itself. And none of it was explained. None of what happened to Sandhurst in the sand, what happened to all this sort of training institutions they were doing? What happened to the project of training the Afghan armed forces? These moments pass and people don't ask those questions. And I think now is a very important time. There's a kind of vulnerability, there's a bombast, there's this idea that all this hard power is being used in diplomatic ways. It's a new diplomacy to take a huge gunboat to China to show off, absolute rubbish. But it's of a piece with all the other rubbish that gets spoken. It's a moment, to really, really think about how to formulate a politics that's against all this and makes connections with all the other, institutions that are, well, anyway, I won't ramble on, we're at the end, so on and on.
But no, thank you so much. And I think if people take anything from that to think about, how we can reinsert our critique of militarism into our politics.
That war went on for more than the World War I and World War II combined. Yeah. This country has been at war every year since 1914, as Ian Cobain published an article in The Guardian in 2014, coming up to the end of Afghanistan. He wrote a thing showing how every single year since 1914, this country had been at war. If you look at Declassified, you see all these different zones where there are military bases all over the world. There's a lot to educate ourselves about and know what's actually happening. It's very hard with the way everything's shrouded in mystery in the media we have, and sort of slavishly going after whatever the British Army does and what it means and everything. You have to really work hard to find out what's going on. But the information is there if you want. There's some great websites and journalists working on it.
So I foresee a strand in next year's The World Transformed about how we share that information with each other and link it to other struggles. Thank you all for your time. I really, all of us so much appreciate it for you to give up your Sunday evening, and I hope to see you in actual meet space before too long. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you, Gagi.
Thanks, Gagi. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Now, listen, guys, we have got a very special guest to round up the show before we move on over to the Novara streams. Yes, Tiski Sour is back at TWT, bringing you the good vibes, good times, the rhythms and rhymes. Actually, I bring the rhythms and rhymes. They just bring the good times. Anyway, listen, we've got a special friend here, Emiliano Molino. Yeah, yeah, bruv, do you know what?
I told you it was going to be tricky. I told you.
Because I'm on TV now, innit? Do you know what I mean? No, big up. Emiliano is here from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Very, very, very grateful for you giving up your afternoon. I know
pleasure.
you could be in the pub or at another Left Book Club, obviously.
Obviously.
Obviously. But we appreciate you giving your time to come and join us this evening to talk about the work you do. First of all, Bureau of Investigative Journalism, like, that's a big name for man dem like me who's not very good with big words and that. You get me? So tell me a little something about that. And if we could have quiet on the set, please, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, sure, happy to. And happy to thank you guys for inviting me here. It's a good way to finish off the weekend. So what we do, you know, it sounds intimidating, but it really is like what you'd expect journalism to be, what it should be doing. So instead of basically getting a press release from somebody and just republishing it, which a lot of people seem to be doing, what we do is we investigate. We try to uncover things that people don't want us to uncover. Simple as that, right? And so the team I work with at the Investigative Journalism is called Bureau Local, and it kind of came about to address the fact that there's no more investigations in local papers because local papers and local websites do not have budgets anymore. So we try to help them to do it. We work on collaborative investigations. We do the investigation and we work collaboratively with like local papers and local newsrooms. And we work mainly on things of inequality, really. So my team looks at issues of inequality around jobs, around health inequality, around housing, and around what we call local power, which is, how our councils are basically collapsing.
So I've got a question. Obviously, you mentioned that you work in the Bureau Local, but you guys recently launched the People's Newsroom. I know that's not necessarily your working group, but can you tell us just a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, sure. So the People's Newsroom kind of is the natural extension to the ethos of the Bureau Local. The Bureau Local is all about collaboration. It was all about sort of changing the way we do news, sort of reestablishing trust as well. Because, I think for a lot of people, they look at the news and it doesn't really speak to them. They don't feel that journalists are covering the issues that matter to them. They don't feel that, sometimes they feel actually that, the news is working against them, against their interests and against their communities. So the People's Newsroom was a way of addressing that. And it's a way of helping grassroots communities, grassroots groups develop their own newsrooms and tell their own stories, right? So right now, my colleague Shirish Kulkarni and Megan Lucero, they're working with a youth group, a youth charity in Wales called East to build their own community newsroom, right? And one of the interesting things, I talked to Shirish about this, and when he talks to these youth groups, to these kids, they're like, when you talk to them about creating media, it doesn't really say anything to them. But when you talk about building power, they really know what you're talking about, right? And then you kind of access it through that, right? Like, it's the idea that building your own media is building your own power.
Yeah. So I just wanted to finish it on the fact that I'm familiar with the Bureau's work because I work with the Independent Media Association, so I share a lot of you guys' work, and I want to big you guys up because it's absolutely amazing. So what we want to finish off on is, how can people support you? Yeah. Where can they find you? Socials, website, how can they donate? All of that good stuff.
All right. So the website is thebureauinvestigates.com. If you want to follow Bureau Local, the Twitter is @BureauLocal. If you want to follow me, my Twitter is @Molino. And in the Bureau's website, there's information how to donate, how to support, and all that. And how to sign up to our newsletter. Also, the Bureau Local, I should have said this before, is a network, it's a community, with journalists, with non-journalists, so anybody can join the Bureau Local's network. And we often do, sort of collaborative investigations where we try to bring people in. And so we help you investigate what's going on in your own community, or we ask you to help us out and investigate something. So if you join our network, you can at times get involved with our investigations, and also get like the inside scoop as well, get a bit more extra info and all that.
Sick. Well, who doesn't want to investigate their own community? So
trust me. You know what? Yeah. We hear so often about corruption in the government and, international corruption and just like bad mind things going on in the world. Like the fact that there's people out there who care about finding out, making sure that, we know exactly what's going on. I've been involved in local democracy. I've been involved in, trying to build around national democracy or national politics. And so often you see so many issues come up that you just think to yourself, this ain't right. And one thing I love about what you guys do, specifically, is that you're looking into it and you're actually giving people access to it. And I believe in access. That's one of the big things about TWT is access for everyone, trying to make sure that everyone has access to things. Now, one area that I do love, you mentioned your Twitter before, is your Week in Work little tweet that you do every week. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that? I'm guessing that links into like building your own media and stuff. And why the fuck isn't it a podcast yet?
Don't we have like enough left podcasts? Like we need a few more.
Yeah.
No, this is a
There
work
can
one.
never be enough.
Yeah,
There can never be enough.
Never too much.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like years ago when I was working at IWB Union, I tried to do a podcast, and it's like that is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So you know, I guess you fight the battles you can fight, right? But like on the Week in Work, basically, it kind of came about because I was previously involved in the labor movement and the trade union movement, and you know, it's kind of hard. Like I was a comms officer. I was trying to get news out about what we were doing, and often like people would just ignore us, right? You know, we were organizing strikes of cleaners, you know, huge strikes of cleaners, hundreds of cleaners, and like people didn't really care. So the idea is kind of the fact that over the years, there's like fewer and fewer journalists in the UK that cover what trade unions are doing, cover what's going on in terms of work in the UK, all that, you know, everything that's going wrong with the world of work in the UK. So this is just a little thing I did, which was like, you know, I'm going to bring together all the bits of news that I find over the week, stories that I like, that I find interesting, all the strikes that I'm seeing that are happening, and do a little thread about it so that people know, like, you know, what's going on, and kind of maybe connect some dots as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I just want to get the attention of the staff in the room. If we could close the doors for a sec, please, and keep it quiet, because I really want to hear what Emiliano's got to say.
Cheers,
like,
man.
bro.
Hey, at least somebody does.
I am here for you. Trust me. Like, I love the Week
You're
in
doing
Work.
great, sweetheart.
You're
doing great.
It's awesome.
I'm feeling the love here. I really am.
Oh,
Feeling the love
man,
here
no,
today, guys.
honestly, like, when we got told you was coming in, I was like, hey, the fire flames were on the WhatsApp chat.
I was like, oh wait, he was like, the Bureau investigates? I was like, it's the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. He was like, is it? I was like, yeah, it is.
Because myself, I was involved in the IMA back when it was the Independent Media Funds, and we used to do the weekly things, and I loved it when you guys were featured on our weekly videos, because, like I said, it's about access for everyone, access to information, access to knowledge. One of the big things, like, you know, talking about people trying to support independent media, independent journalism. If people want to actually get involved and be a part of it, like they want to become a journalist or they want to do something where they're actually trying to investigate stuff in their own area, what's like your top 3 tips for them?
Right. So I mean, I guess these are two different things. Like, if you want to investigate your own area, and if you want to kind of be like journalists, like, you know, get into the job, you know, I think I'd say like different things. I think one of them is there's something that you know, or like a community or some reality that you're connected with that other people don't know. And I can tell you stuff that like a lot of people here at TWT are doing every day. Interesting work, interesting activism, interesting research that, you know, your average journalist in the BBC has no idea about. Like, with the kind of thing that you are the expert in. So I say, like, focus on the stuff you know, the stuff that someone else might not know about, like where you have an edge. You know, and I think a lot of people have edges, and they don't realize, like, they don't appreciate the knowledge that they have and the skills that they might have and like what they can bring into it. Because for many years, people have been told, you know, your voice doesn't matter. Either directly or indirectly, they've been told that, right? And that's because it's, you know, let's be honest, it's people that want to protect their thing, right? And don't want new people coming in and doing it better than them, right? So I say that would be one tip. The other tip, I guess, would be, you know, like, hit up a journalist and chat to them about it, you know? Now it's you can kind of find anybody on like Twitter and like LinkedIn or whatever, or on Instagram. You can find people, right? And some people might like fob you off, but some people want to have a chat with you because like they've had your own kind of story, your own trajectory to get to where they are, and they want to share that with you, right? And finally, actually, you know what? Better than me giving you a third tip, get a third tip from my colleague Vicky Gale, because I think she's doing an event soon where she's going to be talking about how she got into journalism, actually. So if you follow her on Twitter, Vicky Gale, I think she's posted it recently, about like an event she's doing in like in the old journalism school where she went to study, where she's given like her trajectory and how she got into it and like how you do it. So that's the last thing I'd say.
That was a great plug. That was like a cliffhanger. You left us on a cliffhanger, didn't give us a third point, and then was like, yeah, you have to watch this.
Yeah, that's it.
Definitely. Claudia, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just wanted to big up you guys' work because it's absolutely great. Again, please, if you see an email from me every week asking what stories you want me to share across the independent media pages, just send them my way and I'll be happy to do it.
No, I appreciate the support.
Yeah, 100%. You've got the full support of TWT, obviously the IMA as well.
And Bywire.
Yeah, and Bywire. All the independent media news that we get on TWT TV here at TWT 21 is powered by Bywire. But big love to the IMA, big love to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, Big love to you, Emiliano, and obviously the man them, the gal them, all them at IWGB, because you know you got love there as well. Thank you so much for coming through. Listen up, guys. If you appreciate this kind of stuff, exactly what Emiliano is talking about, Claudia, tell them.
Donate, support, like, comment, and subscribe. Please. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Real talk. Oh my days. Honestly, yeah. Listen, guys, this is not the end of TWT TV for the day. We are moving on over to Novara Media. So if you want to check them out, they will be live in just over 15 minutes from Brighton. Obviously, it's the Tisky Sour crew. Do you know what? I just had a whiskey sour drink, and I'm ready for the Tisky Sour live.
Let's go.
Come on. It's a lot. But before you go, think_become. Claudia Fuel.
Claudia Fuel. I'm so sorry. I was going to say TWT_ now. I got confused.
She's forgotten her own Twitter now. Emiliano, what's your Twitter?
At Molino, and also follow at Bureau Local.
How did you get such a short Twitter name? Like, no one had it before you.
I'm the first Molino.
You know, I might be able to sell it one day.
The messed up thing is sometimes I get tagged into like stories about random like Latin American soap opera stars. They think I'm the guy, you know? So I got like all these teenagers randomly tagging me for no reason.
Though. It's free.
Yeah, helps the reach. Helps the reach.
Come for the soap opera, stay for the work news.
Are you on TikTok?
No, not yet, no.
All right, well, you can just follow.
Oh, my TikTok's Wavy You.
Wavy You, don't know. We're all about the plugs here. And the final plug of the day, you know what it is. Donate, subscribe, support the ting, keep it real, keep it a vibe, keep it alive. We're going to pass over to Novara in 15 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people and all the man them, all the gal them. This is TWT TV, day 2. We will be back, we will be live, we will be ready, and we will be bigger than ever for a big day tomorrow. Come back, check out the ting. Keep your YouTube locked. Don't forget to subscribe and donate. Peace, love, solidarity. Brrr.